Okay, today's daf we're learning is Pesachim daf Yud Chet. Before we start, I just want to encourage everyone. We had a circle of friends for 2020 and a lot of you joined. And I want to encourage you now before the year end to join our 2021 circle of friends. All the details are on the site. And it's just a way to help support all the work that Hadran is doing and allow us also to expand. We're going to start a new course, as I mentioned before. I'll kind of mention it again, which in January, we're going to start a 10-week course leading up to Pesach, learning the 10th parak of it's called Arvei Pesachim, all about Seder, the Leil HaSeder, and it'll be a good way to start learning background to how the Gemara is structured, all the things that we don't get to do in Daf Yomi, go in depth and question and try to understand better the structures of the Gemara, how it works. We'll be doing that starting in January. So in general, we need your support at Hadran, so please think of joining our circle of friends if you want to make a bigger donation or smaller donation, whatever works for you, but definitely recommended. The Circle of Friends is $360 a year, 1,200 shekel. It's basically like $1 a day. So if you listen to the shiurim and you're enjoying them, please consider joining. Okay, we're going to start with a bit of an introduction. So right now, I'm going to pull up a chart that I did. Why is it not? Oh, here. Okay. So what we did, it started on Tet Zayin. We're going to make reference to a bunch of things we learned in the last few dapim. I know these pages are hard, and I know it's not easy, and I know a lot of people are struggling. So I just want to give a bit of encouragement in saying that we've only touched on Tum and Tara a bunch of times so far. We're going to touch on them many, many more times as we go on. But I want you to know that it'll become much easier as time goes on. The more we learn them, the more they'll get into your head more. And these topics will come up over and over again. The first or second or third or fourth time you don't understand them, it's okay. Over time, you'll understand them better. And sometimes there's complicated pages and we struggle through them, but you can get there. And in a few days, we're going to be finished with them and we're going to be back to Pesachim issues. So with that, let's get started. So I'm going to try today to organize what we've learned so that you'll be clear on it. I also recommend, by the way, that if you want to review the last few pages, there's a few things that would be helpful. One is Gita put up a great review on all the background of Tum and Tara. There's also one in Hebrew that somebody else wrote in Hebrew of a lot of background information that's helpful for this. You also, the Schottenstein, if you have that, it has a good introduction to the section. Number two, if you look back at the sheets that I organized, the sheets that go alongside, you can see the structure of the Gemara of what we've gone through, and that's a good way to review. Okay, we don't have enough time to review everything in class, but that's a good, helpful tip. Okay, with that, we're going to review starting from page Tet Zayin at the top, and that's what we're in the middle of dealing with, which is Tumat Mashkin from the Torah or not? So we saw 3, possibly 4 opinions, which possibly only become 2 opinions, which we're going to see. So we started with Rabbi Meir. Okay, this is the Braita right at the top of Tet Zayin Amud Aleph. He said that if you have a suffix about mashkim, whether they became tamei or not, we're going to say they are tamei because mashkim are mitame, they become tamei on a doraita level. Liquids can become impure, but they don't pass on impurity by Torah law. And therefore, if you have a liquid that became tamei on a Torah level, but you're not sure if it came in contact with something else, then we're going to say, oh, that suffix derabanan likula because it's only derabanan. Okay, the fact that those liquids pass on impurity is only rabbinic in nature. Then we said Rabbi Elazar said the same thing, to which the Gemara said, did he really say the same thing? Because we thought that Rabbi Elazar thought that there's no mashkim in the Torah at all. And that's how we got into the whole Beit Mitzvah Chaim, because the rabbis were lenient in the temple. And then it was a whole debate. What exactly were they lenient about in the temple? So there, we don't really know, are they one and the same? And that's why I said it's not clear how many approaches there are, or are they different? So here I put, whether or not they become tamei is a source of debate, what Rabbi Elazar himself thinks. Now we move to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said, tamei lakol, which sounded like they become impure, they pass on impurity, and even though it's not so clear from those words, but from the continuation that Rabbi Yose and Rabbi Shimon say something else, it seems clear that Rabbi Yehuda thinks they pass on impurity both to vessels and to foods, because he says lakol. In other words, both they become pure and they pass on impurity, and they seem to pass on impurity to everything, although we ended yesterday by saying Rabbi Yehuda must have changed his mind. And he doesn't really think they pass on impurity to vessels, But in the Braita, he appears as saying that because of a contradiction. That's how we ended yesterday's class, a contradiction with some other source he said, where it seems clear he doesn't think they pass on to vessels. He must have changed his mind. And today we're going to start with, what did he change his mind about? And here I'll just set up the question before we even read it inside. Or actually, I'll wait one more second. I'll go on to Rabbi Yose and Rabbi Shimon, and then I'll explain. Rabbi Yose and Rabbi Shimon say, yes, mashkim are mitamei midoraita. Yes, they become tamei. But do they pass on impurity? Well, yes, but only partially, only to foods, not to kelim, not to vessels. So the question becomes about Rabbi Yehuda is, when he changed his mind, there's two options. Either he said, liquids do not pass on impurity at all, in which case he'd be holding like Rabbi Meir. Or he said they pass on to foods and not to vessels, and then he'd be holding like Rabbi Yose and Rabbi Shimon. So there's basically, that's why I said we started off with 4, but maybe Rabbi Elazar agrees with Rabbi Meir, and therefore they're only one opinion, in which case we were down to 3. And then Rabbi Yehuda changed his mind, either to hold like Rabbi Meir or to hold like Rabbi Yose or Rabbi Shimon, so we become down to 2 really. So that's what we have in terms of Tumat Mashke. Okay, that's our background for right now. Okay, now we're going to go back to the inside of the Gemara. So starting from Yud Zayin Amud Bet at the bottom, Ibayalihu, we're starting from 6 lines at the bottom. Mikelim Huda Hadarbe. I want to say one thing, by the way, about these pages. These pages are a little complicated in terms of the content. In terms of the structure, they're very clear-cut structure. And that's why the sheets that I make are meant to give you the perspective of the structure of where we've started, what we've done. So, okay, so let's go. So again, this is what I said the question is going to be. Did he just change his mind about kelim, but he still thinks that liquids pass on impurity to food? Or, and then he would hold like Rabbi Yose and Rabbi Shimon. O Dilma legamre hadarbe ke Rabbi Meir, or did he entirely change his attitude and go from one extreme to the other, from saying it's mitame everything, or it's mitame nothing? Okay, maybe he went all the way. So Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Now it would be strange to say he went all the way, and I'm already going to preface this by saying the structure is, again, if you understand the structure, it's already half the battle. The structure is going to be, we're going to bring a Mishnah in Masechet Para as an attempt to basically show that Rabbi Yehuda must have changed his mind about everything and gone like Rabbi Meir, cold turkey. No, it can't be matame anything. But we're going to reject it as a proof for 2 reasons, in which case we're actually going to be left without an answer to the question, okay? Because we're going to bring one source to try to prove and then reject it and say, no, it's not for the reasons you think, it's for other reasons, and therefore you can't learn from this to our situation, and therefore we end up without an answer. And then what the Gemara is going to do after that is move on to Rabbi Yose, okay? And Rabbi Shimon really, but really they're going to only focus on Rabbi Yose. So let's read inside. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Tashma. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, let's learn from here. Remember, Tashma means Bo'u Lamad, and they bring some other source, and they say we're going to learn from that source. Para sheshateta mechatat. Okay, before we move on, we have to explain a few things. What is mechatat? Mechatat is water that came from animals. Okay, water that came from a para aduma. It's a para aduma ashes, which was used, the red heifer, used to purify people. And it goes from, it's the ashes mixed with water. And then what we're going to have is that water got drunk by a para. So we prepared the waters to purify people. And then a cow drank the waters. Okay, now this is a little bit strange, but okay, that's the situation. The cow drank the waters. But the question is, there's something weird about the mechatat, if you remember. The mechatat is purifying waters. It purifies, right? It basically is there to purify anything that, that anyone that becomes, or anyone or any item that came in contact with a dead body. Okay, tumat met. But those waters actually cause anyone who touches them and vessels that touch them to become impure. It's always this weird thing they talk about. You know, what purifies also causes impurity. So now the question becomes, what happens once that water got swallowed by an animal And let's say we slaughter the animal. Okay, the first thing you have to know is a person can become tameh when they're alive. Obviously, we've talked about that all the time. An animal can't become tameh until it's dead, and then it turns into food, and food can become tameh. So if that mechatat is inside this animal, in its stomach, intestines, or wherever it is, so they say, and then you slaughter the animal. So a parasha shatita mechatat, it's 4 words that you have to know a lot to understand what those 4 words mean. And then you slaughter the animal, bisara tameh. According to Tanakama, if the water is still kind of intact inside the body of the animal, now that water, which is water that's mitame, comes in contact with the animal, it causes the meat to become impure, the meat of the animal. But Rabbi Yehuda Omer, now remember, the water is obviously a liquid, so that's what it has to do with our topic. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, bitzlu b'me'eha, it's nullified in the intestines of the animal. It has no more power to do anything. So it sounds like what he's saying is the meat is not impure, okay? Because it loses all of its potency, so to speak. Now, what does this have to do with our topic? Well, and this is a bit of a jump, okay? And that's why in the end, the Gemara is going to reject it. So don't be concerned, oh, this doesn't make so much sense to me. But if you want to say that Rabbi Yehuda only changed his mind partially, he still thinks that liquids pass on impurity to foods. He just doesn't think that they pass on impurity to vessels. Well then, why would it be entirely nullified in the intestines of the animal? Maybe we'd say, okay, these mechatat waters lose some of their potency, but they're still a liquid. And if liquids on a d'oraita level pass on impurity to foods, then maybe we'd say d'oraita this doesn't work by Torah law because they've already been swallowed up into the animal, but they still on a d'Rabbanan level, right? Because anytime you start d'oraita, when your d'Rabbanan is going to be a little less, but you're going to actually drop it down somewhat. You're not going to get rid of it entirely. So they're going to say it should still be mitamu tum'a kala mi'anitamu. It still should have some sort of tumah to it, because if he's stringent, the basic idea is, again, it's not a perfect proof. And soon the Gemara is going to totally reject this. But what they're suggesting is, since he holds that we're going to be strict about mashkim, liquids in general, and there's a machloket here between 2 people, right? And he's got the most extreme opinion at this point, because even though he's not as extreme as he was, there's only one extreme opinion, which basically says that liquids do pass on impurity by Torah law. So why would the rabbis be the ones more stringent here and Rabbi Yehuda more lenient? Theoretically, if he's strict with liquids in general, he should take this. This is a liquid also, and maybe not by Torah law, but it still should pass on impurity. So the Gemara is going to reject this for two different approaches. So my bitlu b'me'eha nami bitlu mitumah chamura aval tumah kala metamu. Maybe when he said bitlu b'me'eha, he meant on a Torah level, and maybe on a rabbinic level, he'll hold that the meat is impure. So theoretically, and really what they're saying, what does it mean tumah chamura? That the liquids don't, now normally remember what happened, the mechatat before it got swallowed up, it would mess up, it would cause, pass on impurity to humans and to vessels. So what they're trying to say is, once the animal swallows it, it no longer, let's say I slaughter the animal and I open up the insides and water comes out from the mechatat. So if I touch that, well, when he says bitzlo b'me'eh, it means it can no longer matame meat, but it still has the power to matame the meat of the animal. And then that would be exactly what we were suggesting, that if he holds mashkin or deoraita, then it would be matame the meat. But obviously to read the Braita the Mishnah that way would be very difficult. Why? Because there's a debate in the Mishnah. And what does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah says, right, so I see you're asking, which is the obvious question, Tova, which is, and this is what I was trying to figure out last night when I was preparing, what's exactly the reality here? Is this really realistic that we're going to open up the animal, find mechatat? How are we going to know that it's mechatat? How are we going to, let's ignore reality here, okay? I think they're trying to create a theoretical situation that I'm not sure really actually would be, but let's keep it in our minds in that way. So now he says like this, if you're going to say that what he really means is the meat is tameh, but it doesn't pass on impurity to people or vessels like the mechatat originally did, so then the Mishnah makes no sense, because remember, Tanakama said, B'sarat tameh, the meat of the animal is impure, and Rabbi Yehuda said, bitzlu b'me'ah. It's nullified in its inside. Now, the reason they took the liberty to kind of explain a little differently is because Rabbi Yehuda didn't say the meat is not tameh. He just said it's nullified. But even if you say nullified means it can't pass on impurity to people and vessels, and it does to meat, well, the beginning doesn't make sense because Tanakama, so let's just read it. Michlal, from here you're going to infer. If he thinks it makes the meat impure, then Tanakama would obviously have to disagree. What would they say? Tanakama savar tuma chamura nami mitamu. You'd have to say, since Tanakama didn't say it's nullified in the insides of the animal, you'd have to assume that Tanakama thinks it also is mitame people and vessels. And that's certainly not what Tanakama said. Ha b'sarat tameh katane. Tanakama said the meat is impure, which is basically what we're trying to attribute to Rabbi Yehuda. That doesn't make any sense. So the Gemara says, no, you could explain it like this. Kula Rabbi Yehuda v'chisuri machasra v'hachi katane. Really, the entire thing is Rabbi Yehuda. And again, the reason they say this is because the opinions aren't pure opposites. It's not like b'sarat tameh and b'sarat lo tameh, right? Which would have made it very clear what they're saying. But maybe you could read that the whole thing is Rabbi Yehuda, and then you'd have to say it's missing words. This is a very common thing where they say, well, we're going to really say these look like two different opinions, but we're really going to say they're one and the same, and there's just missing the segue between the first part and the second. So how does it work? There's missing words, and this is how it should read. Parasha shateta mechatat. Okay, that's already the same thing. Psarat tameh, so far that's Tanakama, but really we're going to say that's Rabbi Yehuda. Now, what kind of tumah are we talking about? Bitum'ah kala. It's only light tumah, meaning it only messes up the meat. Aval tum'ah chamura lo, but you no longer have the tum'ah chamura of Adam and Kelim that Mechatat normally has. Why not? Rabbi Yehuda Omer bitzlu b'me'eha, because Rabbi Yehuda says it's nullified in the insides of the animal, and that comes to explain the first line. Okay, not that it doesn't have tumah at all. Now, again, why did we bring this? I'm going to remind you. We brought this to suggest that maybe Rabbi Yehuda changes his mind entirely, because look, he's so lenient here in this case. In the end, we're going to say he's not so lenient. You thought he didn't think the meat is impure. It is impure because it's a liquid, and liquids, right, cause impurity. They might not cause the same impurity they had before they were swallowed. They're not going to pass on impurity like mechatat normally does to a person in vessels, but it will still pass on impurity to the animals. And that's all because tumah midoraita does pass on liquids on a doraita level pass on impurity to food. And this is food, and it passes on the impurity. That's one way of reading it. In which case, as I said, we're back to square one. We don't really know what he holds. This is just a possible suggestion, but you can read the Mishnah in both ways. Rav Ashi Amar, he gives a different reason. His reason, according to Rav Ashi, now you can keep the Mishnah intact. You don't have to change it at all. Rav Ashi Amar la'olam bitzlu b'me'eha legamri. And yet still, and that you could still say that Rabbi Yehuda thinks liquids in general pass on impurity on a Torah level to food. But yet, in this case, they're lenient. Why are they lenient? Mishum dehave le'mashkeh saruach. Because once it goes, and this is probably what you were thinking in the first place, once the water goes through the body of the animal, it's kind of contaminated. It's disgusting. It's rotten. It's not water. It's not mechatat anymore. First of all, you have to think about mechatat. I mean, they were so careful how to keep everything in perfect purity, and they had children dealing with that. There are all sorts of interesting things we're going to learn about the paraduma, right? And then it goes inside the animal. We're still going to call it a paraduma waters. This isn't even water. Now, there's something really interesting about this. Because what tumah people even can call it somewhat contaminated, right? It's almost like impure, but it's not. In order for impurity to pass, this is very fascinating. It has to be passed through items that are not ruined, so to speak. Okay. So if something, remember tumah ochlin is it has to be a food. If it's not considered food and it's so disgusting and ruined, well, then it can't pass on impurity. Okay. Purity can only be passed on by something that's actually a food or a liquid. This we're not even going to call a drink, a liquid. It's putrid. So basically, we're going to say, no, this doesn't teach us anything about anything because it would have to be a real mashkeh, a liquid that's not ruined. This is ruined. So therefore, two reasons to reject this, and we're left with, we don't really know what Rabbi Yehuda changed his mind about. Again, I would think that logically we would assume that he changed his mind about just minorly, and he shifted to Rabbi Yose, because usually people, when they change their mind, they don't do a full turnaround and change their mind entirely, but it's unclear. Now we're going to move on to Rabbi Yose's opinion. Rabbi Yose and Rabbi Shimon omrim le'ochlim tmeim lekelim tohorim. So now we're going to go into this opinion and we're going to see the root, the source for it. And the first thing we're going to say, okay, so again, Rabbi Yose and Rabbi Shimon hold liquids by Torah law pass on impurity. Yes, they do. Not like Rabbi Meir who thought they don't. But they only pass them on to food and not to vessels. Now we're going to see what's the source for that. And we're going to start by saying that Rabbi Yose, okay, I'll read it inside. Amar Rabba bar bar Chana Amar Rish Lakish, Rabbi Yose b'shitat Rabbi Akiva Rabo Amara. He must be holding like Rabbi Akiva, his teacher, okay, about the following thing. Didarish yitma yitameh. The Torah sometimes uses the words tamehu, it is impure, and sometimes it uses the words yitma, it will become impure. Now, it could have simply said tameh, it's impure, which kind of sounds like endgame, it's impure. But if you say yitma, first of all, it's in the future. And it's also, if you do the vowels different, it sounds like yitameh. Yitameh means it will pass on impurity. So Rabbi Akiva had this opinion, and we're going to read it inside in a minute. It was actually a very unique opinion, but that in a particular verse, yitma doesn't mean it's the end game. It became impure and that's it. But it means it can also pass on impurity. And that's where Rabbi Yose is going to learn that liquids also pass on impurity, because he takes a different word, yitma, in the Torah, and he learns from it, it will pass on impurity. Now, I want to stop here just for a quick minute because we're going to end today's daf. We're not going to actually get to it, but the end of the daf starts a whole other section, which is too complicated to start in the middle of and kind of leave off in the middle. So I'm going to kind of end a little before the end of the page today. But the end of this Gemara, and it's kind of like that. I always go back to that bus driver joke, right? What was the name of the bus driver? You don't remember anymore when you tell the whole joke. So likewise here, I want to point this out now because at the end, we're going to see, okay, the last line we're going to learn today is that Ravina says to Rav Ashi, but didn't Rava say that Rabbi Yose doesn't hold like Rabbi Akiva? Okay, and then he also says, and Rabbi Akiva doesn't hold like Rabbi Yose. Okay, and we're going to get into all that, what that is tomorrow. But basically, we're starting by saying Rabbi Akiva holds like Rabbi Yose. Rabbi Yose holds like Rabbi Akiva is rabbi. Only at the end of the page are we going to basically say, but there's a different approach that says Rabbi Yose isn't holding like Rabbi Akiva is rabbi. Now, Rabbi Akiva has a very strange approach. I'm going to just review some laws of basic Tum and Tara so that you're going to see how Rabbi Akiva is different from everything we've learned until now, or a major thing we've learned until now. There's the Avatuma, Rishon, Sheni, Shlishi, Revi. Remember that all the dargot. So, right? There's a Viavota Tumaivim, which is a dead body. That's the most tummy. That can make person, vessels, items, right, impure. Or an Avatuma could be a Zav, a Zava, Yoled, a Mitzora, all different kinds of Asheretz, right, a creature, one of them. Those are called Avatuma. They pass on impurity to people, vessels, food, and drink. Anything that comes in direct contact, this is all very important for today's shiur. Anything that comes in direct contact with an avatuma, right, or a tamei, someone who was in contact with a dead body is also an avatuma. Anyone who comes in contact with any of those things becomes a rishon. Rishon can only pass on impurity to food and drink. That's it. And today we're going to learn if it's food, it can only pass on to drinks. And if it's drinks, it can only pass on to food and not to vessels. That's the whole thing we're dealing with right now, right? That liquids can't pass on things to vessels. Also food we're going to see can't pass on impurity to vessels. Then usually that's the end, okay? Sheni is the end if we're in the realm of chulin, regular stuff that you have and I have in my house. But if we're kohanim and we have truma, or if we're in the temple and we have something that's sanctified, so a sheni can pass on tuma to a shlishi. And then a shlishi can pass on to a revi'i. Revi'i is only not for truma. Remember, truma ends at 3, and that's chulin ends at 2. Truma ends at 3. Kodshim, sacrificial stuff, ends at 4. Okay? Tomorrow we'll see that maybe there's an approach that sacrificial meat can even go on to 5, but we'll leave that aside for right now. So here's Rabbi Akiva's interesting shita, which doesn't fit with one of the things I just said. So Ditnan, as it says in the following Mishnah, first we're going to see where Rabbi Akiva darshans this yitma is yitameh, it will pass on impurity. And then we're going to go back to Rabbi Yose, where he darshans yitma means yitameh, because they're each going to be talking about different things. Ditnan, as it says in the Mishnah, Bo bayom. Okay, what's bo bayom? On that day. What's that day? Okay, let's go back to brachot. Remember the famous story of Rabban Gamliel when they kicked him out of the Beit Midrash after he embarrassed Rabbi Yeshua, and they brought in Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. And remember, Rabban Gamliel was very careful about who was allowed in the Beit Midrash. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah opens the doors. Tons of people come flying into the Beit Midrash, and on that day, tons of halachas were taught. All sorts of things. Lots of rabbis came forward and said, I learned this, I learned that, I learned that. So on that day, Rabbi Akiva darshan the following law. A lot of halachas come out that they were bo bayom. V'chol kli cheres asher yipol mehem. Okay, let's read the whole verse. Okay, this is Vayikra Yud Aleph Lamed Gimel. In another minute, we're going to darshan the next pasuk. Any kli cheres, any earthenware vessels, asher yipol mehem el tocho, if a sheretz falls inside them. Okay, now let's go through our rules. Sheretz is an av. It goes into a utensil that becomes a rishon. Kol asher b'tocho yitma. Any food or drink that's in that vessel will become tameh. All that food and drink is a sheni, l'tuma. Now at that point, the tuma should end. But you already know that what did Rabbi Akiva darshan? Yitma means yitameh. It will pass on impurity. So here comes the big chiddush of Rabbi Akiva. Eino omer tameh ela yitma. The fact that the Torah uses the language yitma, kind of future tense, as opposed to tameh, it is impure, which would be endgame, it sounds like yitma acherim. Limed al kikar sheni shoseh shlishi b'chulin. He holds that there's such a thing as a shlishi in chulin. Food can pass on impurity to other items, even as a shlishi in chulin. Okay, that's a very unique opinion. He seems to be the only one who holds this. He thinks that there is a shlishi in chulin. So against what we've always set up. Now, let's zoom in now to Rabbi Yose. Where is his yitma? By us, where does he darshan? So the next verse, and I'm not going to read from here where it quotes in the Gemara, I'm going to read from the whole pasuk because it quotes only the middle. And again, the whole verse is important for our purposes. If you have the Torah or on the side, it has it. Some Gemaras have the wording on the side. Mikol ha'ochel asher ye'achel. Any food that can be eaten. Again, there you see it has to be edible and not ruined. Asher yavo alav mayim. Oh, if it's food, what does it need? It needs a liquid first to create susceptibility to impurity. Yitma. So any food that can be eaten, right? What does it say? That water comes upon it first. It gets in contact with one of the liquids. Yitma. Again, he's going to say yitma means it can also pass on impurity. V'chol mashke asher yishateh. And any liquid that can be drunk, again, has to be drinkable liquid. V'chol kli yitma. If it's in a vessel, right, and the vessel was impure, it also, what do you see? Yitma becomes impure, but yitma, according to Rabbi Yose, is going to be yitameh. It can also pass on impurity. That's where he gets the mashkim are pass on impurity on a doraita level. And that's what we see. He holds like Rabbi Akiva, where he takes this word yitma and he says it means yitameh. So let's read this inside. Chol mashke asher yishateh b'chol kli yitma, yitameh. Okay, we'll pass on impurity. Now we're going to have a question. What does it pass on impurity to? Now, we already kind of said not kelim, although we're going to raise the question, maybe it can pass on to vessels. We'll get back to that. But right now they say, l'tameh tumat ochlin ataomel. Oh, sorry, l'tameh tumat ochlin, period. So, but now, to what can it pass on impurity? Only to other foods, okay? Not, now we're going to say, and not to other liquids. So now the Gemara questions that. Ataomer l'tameh tumat ochlin? You want to say only food? Oh, I know, l'tameh tumat mashkin. Why wouldn't it pass on also to other liquids? Amart lo kachaya. But you said, no, it's not the case, period. Okay, that's very helpful, right? It's like saying, why can't you do something? Because you can't, right? The parent tell a child, right? Why can't you do something? Because you can't. So the Gemara wants to know, my lo kachaya, why is it not the case? Amalav Papa, we're going to have two different answers. Number one, Rav Papa, lo matzinu tuma she'oseh kayotze ba. Okay, this we actually learned on Daf Yudalet, if you remember. Tuma can't pass on to something that's equal to it, okay? Meaning, food can't pass on to food. Do you remember we had a whole source about that, and there was a debate. Does it mean only in chulin and truma, or maybe chulin, truma, and kodshim? Food can't pass on to food. Now, just to be clear, food does pass on impurity to food, but maybe not from the Torah, okay? Maybe only the rabbis instituted this. But on a Torah level, it's possible. Seems clear from this sugya, the food doesn't pass on impurity to food on a Torah level, okay? Yes, again, the rabbis did. Part of the problem, and I've been realizing this, with any kind of intro to this topic, is that there's so much that's, we're dealing with it on a Torah level, and then we're dealing with it on a rabbinic level. So you might say, well, food doesn't pass on impurity to food. but it does on a rabbinic level. So what are you going to write in your chart? It does or it doesn't, because it's hard to include everything, both the rabbinic and the Torah. I mean, you can start getting into every single detail, but that's already very detail oriented. So anyway, just so you don't get too confused, food can pass on impurity to food and to liquids when it comes on a d'Rabbanan level, but not necessarily in a d'oraita level. Maybe yes to truma, maybe yes to kodshim, but not in chulin. So he says, if truma and ose kayotze ba, then just like food can't pass on impurity to food, liquid can't pass on impurity to liquid. Okay, so that's clear. Now, Ravina Amar migufe dekhanami lo matzid amar. He gives a different reason. Forget that. Forget about that. Let's say you didn't hold by that. I could still prove it from the verse. Now, there's something strange about the structure of the verse. If the verse wanted to say food and liquids both pass on impurity to food and liquids, what would it have said? Or what word would have not been in the verse? The verse says, any food that one eats water comes upon it, becomes impure. And any drink that anyone drinks in any vessel becomes impure. Now, the word becomes impure appears twice. If you wanted to say any food and any drink is the same, they both pass on impurity to food and drink, you would have gotten rid of that yitma in the middle. And that's what he's going to say. Migufe dekra nami lo matzid amar. You couldn't have even suggested that from the pasuk itself, because yitma means l'tamei tumat mashkin. You couldn't have said that yitma means liquids can pass on impurity to liquids. Because if you want to say that the yitma at the end means liquids can pass on impurity to liquids, and the yitma in the middle of the pasuk means the food can pass on impurity to liquids, you should have just made one big mush here. Any food or any drink, yitma. And it doesn't say that. It should have said, and here they tell you what the pasuk should have said. Mikola ochel asher ye'achel, asher yavo alav mayim, and notice they got rid of the word yitma. V'chol mashkeh asher yishateh b'chol kli yitma. So, trei yitma lamali. Why do we have 2 times the word yitma? It must be ela yitma dereisha l'tamei tumat mashkin, yitamei deseifa l'tamei tumat ochlin. It must be to tell you food pass on impurity to liquids, and liquids pass on impurity to foods, like an X here, right? And each one only pass on impurity to the other. And that's why it says yitma twice. So we have 2 proofs, either from this other where we learned it before, which is where Rav Papa says that we came up on Yudalit, that food doesn't pass on impurity to something like it, or from this crisscross here because of the extra word. So now they say, but why are you assuming that it can't pass on impurity to vessels? Maybe it does. Okay, now forget about food, liquid to liquid. What about liquid to vessel? So they say, v'lav kavachomerhu. Wouldn't that just be a simple kal v'chomer? Why? Uma kli shemitame mashke ein mitame kli. A vessel itself, a vessel comes in contact with a sheretz. A vessel can't make another vessel tameh. A rishon can only, we said, pass on impurity to food and drink. So if the vessel itself can't, and where does the strength of the liquid come from? It says in the pasuk, a liquid that became impure by being in a vessel. So if the vessel itself can't pass on impurity to a vessel, then a liquid that became impure from a vessel, all the more so, can't be stronger than the item that it was derived from. But wait, you could say, but wait, there's 2 types of liquids that can become impure. There's sheni, which came from a rishon, which came from a kli, which came from a sheretz. That we're going to say its power comes from the sheretz. Of course, it can't be any stronger than it. But let's say we have a liquid that was a rishon. It came in contact directly with the sheretz. That's not learned out from a kli. So maybe maybe we could distinguish liquids that are rishons can't pass on impurity to vessels. But liquids that are shenis that come from a kli, and a kli can't pass on to a kli, obviously those liquids can't. But the Gemara says, but wait, mashkina ba'imach mat sheretz miktive, but wait, where do we even learn? Okay, and this is interesting. Where do we learn that a sheretz can make a liquid tameh? Not from the Torah. The only place where liquids are mentioned in the Torah is the verse we quoted. That verse was liquids that were in a vessel. So now they say, where do we learn that a sheretz can directly cause a liquid to become impure? From a kal v'chomer, from a kli. V'lav mi kal v'chomer ka'ate, doesn't it come from a kal v'chomer itself? Uma mashkina ba'imach makli mitamim. If liquids that came in contact with a rishon become impure, mashkeh ba'imach mat sheretz lo kol shekain, all the more so if the liquid came in contact with something more than that. But now comes the important line. This is a fascinating line. This means if you learn something from a kal v'chomer, So what did we learn? We learned that there's such a thing that a sheretz can make a liquid into a rishon. That doesn't appear in the Torah. Only a rishon making a liquid, a sheni, comes up in the Torah. Since it doesn't come up in the Torah, we must learn it from a kal v'chomer. The fact that a sheretz can create a mashke, can become a rishon, is only a kal v'chomer. Now, when you learn a kal v'chomer from something else, you can't make the law any stringent than the law it was derived from in the first place. So if the whole idea of sheretz, even though it's a higher level of tuma, it's going to be a rishon, but since it's learned out from liquids that are a sheni, it can't be any more stringent than the law it's derived from. That's what Tayovel Avom and Adin Leo Kanidon. If you're going to derive something from a din, din is another word for kal v'chomer, a logical argument, it can't be any more stringent than that one. So if coming from a kli, it certainly can't be matame a kli, because that was a kal v'chomer from a kli itself. Kli can't even be matame a kli. A vessel can't be matame another, can't pass on impurity to vessels. Then of course the liquid, whose strength comes from there, can't pass on impurity to other vessels. Okay, so that's where we get that law from. So now they say, yitma direisha hechi darish. Okay, now we're back to, I just want to double check. I think, yeah, we're back to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says yitma means yitameh. Remember, and that a sheni can make a shlishi in chulin. So what does he do with the yitma in our pasuk? Mikol ochel asher yavo alav mayim yitma. Okay, how does he darshan that pasuk? Yitameh, right? Remember, yitma according to him means yitameh. It can pass on impurity. Litameh tamashkin. It's to teach you that food can pass on impurity to liquids. So now again, they're going to question the same thing we asked before. Ata omer litameh tamashkin. O ena ela litameh takli. Again, drinks we just said can't pass on impurity to other vessels. Maybe food can. So now they're going to say, wait, you just established that drinks can't. We're going to make a kal v'chomer. This is the classic, we just derived that from a kal v'chomer. Well, we can take the logic and now apply it somewhere else. Amar kal v'chomer, uma mashkeh shemitame ochel eino mitame kli. A liquid passes on impurity to food, but can't pass on to a vessel. So ochel is obviously less stringent than mashkeh, and this could be argued, but this is just take it as a given. Ochel she'ein mitame ochel, since food can't pass on impurity to food, and liquids can pass on impurity to food, so that puts liquids at a stronger position. And if liquids are at a stronger position, then liquids don't pass on to vessels, so obviously then food doesn't. So ein odin shelo yitame kli. So therefore, obviously food also can't pass on to vessels. But then they say hamani makayem yitma. So then what is yitma? It can't be mitame food. It can't be mitame vessels food, right? And food is kayotze ba. We already said it's the same. You can't be kalim, because we just learned that from a kal v'chomer from the drinks. So what do they say? It's litameh tamashkin. What's left, right? Liquids. But then they add this interesting line. It's not clear why they add this. Shehem alulim lekabel tuma. There's a few things. Not clear why they added this and not clear what this even means. Alulim lekabel tuma means they're likely to become tameh. Okay. Whoever said liquids are likely to become tameh, not so clear. So first they asked the first question, which is Ma'iri mashkin mishum de alulim lekabel tuma. Why did you even have to say liquids? Because they're likely to become tameh. Tipukle mishum de leka midi achrina. You should just say simply, well, we got rid of the option of food. We got rid of the option of vessels. What else could it possibly pass on impurity to if not liquids? So it must be liquids by process of elimination. So why did you need to add the word shehem alulim lekabel tuma? So that they're going to answer hachi kamar. This is what you should say. Like I said, you can flip the logic on its side. Even though we said liquids are more stringent because they're matame food, they pass on to food, but food is more stringent because they pass on to liquids, whereas food doesn't, as liquids don't pass on to liquids. So you could flip the logic and say like this. So maybe ochel is more stringent because it also passes on impurity to liquids. Therefore, nitamya lekli, you might have thought it can purify vessels. But they say, ha'u chumra demashkinhu. Ha'u chumra nitmei lekli, ha'u chumra demashkinhu, mishum demashkin alulim lekabel tum'ah. They say, no, the reason why they pass on to liquids is because liquids are prone to becoming tameh. Okay, now why are they prone to becoming tameh? Umahi alilata. That's why if we're going to have a choice, and theoretically you could have said maybe it's more stringent than liquids, but the reason it passed on to liquids specifically is because they're prone to becoming impure. So now, what does it mean prone to becoming impure? Shelo behechsher shelo b'hechsher. What does that mean? Foods, what did we say? They have to come in contact with liquids in order to be able to pass on impurity, but in order to become impure. But liquids don't need that. You don't need a liquid to get on a liquid. The liquids are already ready. They're sitting there kind of waiting. Oh, touch me, I'll be impure. So because of that, they're more prone. And that's why if we're going to say anything, it must be whatever's the most prone to becoming impure. Yitma. Now we're back to the word yitma. We're going to have a different drasha on the word yitma. De'ein oseh kayotze ba. Remember we said food can't pass on impurity of food, or liquid can't pass on impurity of liquid. Where do we learn that from? The word yitma. Now, they're taking this word yitma and they're saying two things about it. First, we said yitma sounds like more than just tameh, right? Yitma means it becomes impure, but it says it in a strange way. It must be saying it can also pass on impurity. But we read it as yitameh. But if you read it the way it's actually supposed to be said in the Torah as yitma, it sounds like it just becomes impure, which sounds like on the one hand, it's extending to something. On the other hand, it's limiting. It's got both elements to it. So what's it limiting? It must be limiting that, yes, it can pass on, let's say, food to liquids, but food not to food. And that's why it's kind of expanding, but also limiting. So now they say, wait a minute. If you remember on Yud Daled, you might not remember this because we've been involved in complicated sugyas, but I'll remind you. And the Gemara is reminding us. Mehachanafka, you're going to learn that Eno Sekayotze Ba from there. We already learned it on Daf Yud Daled, Mehatam Nafka, from a different pasuk. Ki yutan mayim al zera, if liquid falls on food, v'nafal minivlatam alav, and then a nevela, which is also tameh, a dead animal, comes upon it. Hu tameh ve'ein oseh tuma kayotze ba. Now, it says tamehu. It is impure. Now here you get the tameh. That's the limiting. What does it mean tamehu? It's impure. Yes, it can pass on impurity, but in a limited manner, meaning it doesn't pass on tuma to another piece of meat or another item of food. So if you learned it from there, why do you need to learn it from the word yitma? So they say, you need two. Why? Because again, this goes back to something we said earlier. There's two types of liquids. Okay, we started with solids, but it's the same idea that liquids can't pass on to liquids and solids can't pass on to solids. So they say, there's two types. One is more strict than the other, right? So one is to teach you if it's a rishon, and one is to teach you if it's a sheni, basically, right? If it came in contact directly with the sheretz, it still can't pass on to other liquids. And if it came in contact with the kli and it's only a sheni, it also can't pass on to liquids, utsricha. And you need both. Why? And this is going to be a strange stricha because it's only going to go in one direction. Usually stricha says if we had that one, we wouldn't be able to learn that. If we had the other one, we wouldn't be able to learn the other one. So this is going to only go in one direction. If you said it only when it was a sheni l'tuma, second degree tuma, you would say maybe it's mishum de lo chamiri. It's less strict. That's why it doesn't pass on to liquids. Ema ose tuma kayotze ba, but maybe when it's tamei machmat sheretz, it's already a higher level tuma. Maybe it would pass on to liquids. That's why you need both. Okay, so then they say, since you didn't say it in both directions, why don't they just say maybe the Torah should have taught us by the sheretz, and then kol shekeh mashkima ba'im machmat kli. And then you would have known, obviously, if high level tuma doesn't pass on to liquids, then obviously lower level tuma won't pass on to liquids. So they say, sometimes something that's obvious, the Torah anyway specifies it. So basically we say these two places that we learned it out from, the Yitma and Tamehu, are both to teach you it's even liquids that come in contact with the sheretz directly also don't pass on impurity to other liquids. And likewise, liquids that come in contact with the kli and are only second degree impurity also don't pass on to other liquids. Okay, that's what we're going to learn for today. We're going to start with tomorrow. This line, again, like I told you, it's going back to the beginning. This was all based on the fact that Rabbi Yose held like Rabbi Akiva's rabbi, who darshaned this yitma as yitameh. And now we're going to say, now notice it didn't say that he holds that a sheni is osher shlishi b'chulin. It's just that he holds that type of way of darshaning. And we're going to start tomorrow with, Ravina says to Rav Ashi, I'll just read this first line. V'hama Rava, but didn't Rava say, lo Rabbi Yose savar like Rabbi Akiva, the lo Rabbi Akiva savar like Rabbi Yose. Rabbi Yose didn't hold like Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva didn't hold like Rabbi Yose. And we're going to see in what case are we talking about, what is this, where was this said? Like I said, if I start now, I'll just kind of leave you in the middle. It's like starting the beginning of a phrase and you don't finish the end of the sentence. So I'm going to leave this all to start tomorrow. Have a good day, everyone. I hope that was clear enough.